Next up, we're going to look at another really powerful formatting feature within Excel. Although strictly it's not a formatting feature, it is actually more of a data feature. We're going to look at it here because it has very useful applications in terms of formatting or presenting the way your document works. So here I have a list of records. Different sales that have been made by different salespeople on different days and for different values. This might be a moving list, a list that is simply updated by hand by somebody in the company. But this is the source of data for perhaps some reports I need to run on a monthly basis, and so I need the quality of the data in this table to be of a very high standard. I can't allow users to type confusing text into my cells. I can't allow them to put text where numbers should be, and I can't allow them to put names where dates should be, etc. So I need to restrict or validate the entries that are put into the cells. So to do that, I'm going to use a feature called data validation. So first of all, I have created a blank row in my table, and I'm getting ready to populate it with new information. So let's assume there's a particular user who is not very bright. I want to absolutely restrict the input so that only valid information can be entered. So first of all, a date. I would like to restrict this cell so that only dates can be entered. In fact, I'd actually want to highlight the whole column, but for simplicity, I'm just going to start with this cell. I've selected the cell I want to restrict or apply data validation to. Within the Data tab, I look for Data Validation, and I'm going to click on the main Data Validation button. This will load up my data validation window. As we can see, there are a number of different data validation options. My first column is a date, so I'm going to select date and see what other options are presented. From here, I can have different ways of restricting my date value. So by the fact that I've entered date at the top, any information entered has to be a date. But I can also ensure that my date is between certain different parameters. So I can make sure it is after a certain start date and before a certain end date. Or I can also choose for it to be equal to a certain date, not equal to a certain date. There's lots of different options. But probably the most relevant here would be something like greater than. And I want to make sure that my user can't enter a date that is before today. So I can manually type in today's date and click OK. I now go over to my cell and let's try an experiment. So let's say I haven't had my coffee this morning, I'm really not concentrating on what I'm doing, and I just start typing a salesperson's name in the date cell, like Gil. After I click enter to exit the cell, Microsoft gives me a message, a warning. It says that the value I've entered is not valid. A user has restricted the values that can be entered into this cell. Okay, well, it's a first step. I've certainly not been able to enter incorrect information, but that message wasn't particularly informative. Let's just make sure that the functionality is working and I can enter a date. Let's try retry and have another go. So the word Gil is selected. To clear that text, I'm just going to press the backspace key. And let's try a date after today, greater than today, for example, the 1st of February 2014. And I'm going to hit enter. Sure enough, Excel has allowed me to make that change. Okay, well, let's revisit our data validation and see if we can produce an error message that is a bit more informative. So here we've set the basic parameters of our validation, but we also have the input message box and the error alert. Let's look at both of these in turn. The input message allows me to display a message to the user before they've even finished typing. So this will be a sort of guided prompt. Let's type in some helpful text. Dear user, please enter a valid date format, e.g. DD, month, year. Secondly, let's move on to our error alert. Before we were using just the standard error alert, which just says you can't do that and doesn't really give you any further information. So let's add something a bit more descriptive. Dear user, that input was not valid. Please enter a valid date format, e.g. DD, month, year. Let's click OK to apply all of those changes to our cell and see what has changed. Well, first of all, I get this tooltip automatically appear on my page. And there's my message. Dear user, please enter a valid date format, e.g. DD, month, year. So straight away, as soon as I click into the cell, I've been given a guide. I've been given a prompt, and I'm told what information needs to be entered. Let's say I've still managed to somehow ignore this information, and I go ahead and type a salesperson's name again, and click enter. I now get an error message, much as I did before, but it's a bit more informative. The input was not valid, please enter a valid date format. Right, I've got it. Not only do I know that there's an error, but I know what the error is and I know what's expected of me. So I can go to retry, clear the current information, and add, let's say, 2nd of February 2014. In fact, there's one bit of information I probably should have added to my error message and told them that it needs to be a valid date format after the date 31st of January 2014. But for our example, this is sufficient. There's other types of validation we can use. Let's start off with another bit of simple validation on something like our unit value. I'm going to restrict the values that can be entered here, again by going to Data Validation, enter my settings first of all, and I'm going to restrict it to whole numbers. Because we are talking about a quantity of units, I don't want somebody to be able to enter 0.75 units, because that doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to suggest that the user must complete a whole number, and that value can be between 0 and, let's say, 1,000,000. I can also apply the input message and error alert as I did before. Let's try a custom error alert on this situation. So before, we only changed the message that was displayed to the user. It was informative and effective. It didn't allow the user to proceed unless they complied with our request. But there's sometimes that we don't want to be that demanding. We rather want to push our user in the right direction, but they're really stubborn and they really want to do it their way, then we might let them. If that is the situation that you want to instill in your workbook, you can choose a different style of error. For example, a warning. A warning will display a different type of symbol. And rather than a stop, which will not allow them to proceed, a warning does give them the option to proceed. So let's try that and see what happens. Dear user, please enter a value between 0 and 1,000,000. No decimals, please. I can check back to my settings, make sure my settings are in place, and click OK. My user can then come along and enter the value 5, for example, without any worries. They can enter the value 1. They can even enter the value 0. But can they enter the value 2 billion or million? No, they will get an error. But notice the error style is now different. It gives them the same message that I wanted to display, but it gives them the option to continue. Yes, no, cancel. So if they click no, they're able to go back and edit. If they click yes, they can simply overrule my request and leave in the 2 billion number that they've chosen to add. I have a little green symbol in the corner of my cell informing me that I have a data validation error, that this number doesn't comply with the data validation rules. But if that doesn't worry me, and I want to get rid of the green label in the corner, I can simply ignore the error. Let's go back to a more logical and sensible value, like 50 units. The final bit of data validation I want to introduce is perhaps the most common and most powerful, and that is to specify that the value entered in the cell must be an item selected from a predefined list. So let's have a look at how that can work. Again, I will go into my data validation, and instead of a whole number or a date or a decimal, I'm going to pick list. Now I could manually create my own list here by typing one name at a time. For example, Kivel, comma, Gill, comma, Jones, etc. This approach is functional, does the job, but it's not very dynamic. I would rather this list was linked to another range of cells where I could change that range of cells and my drop-down would be affected. So to move from a static list to a dynamic list, I'm going to clear that information. Use the pop-out button here with the red arrow in the middle. Find the range with the list I'm interested in, and here's one I made earlier. Return back to the options and click OK. The values that can be entered into this cell are now restricted. So for example, if I try and type a name that wasn't in my list, such as Peter, I will get an error message. Let's cancel out of that. Let's try a different option, but notice now that I have a little drop-down button. This is similar to a filter header on top of a table. If I click into it, I find that those names that I added to my list are now displayed in the drop-down menu, and the user is only able to pick from these options. Although this is a data validation function, it's actually making the user's life a lot easier. They don't have to remember the exact spelling of the sales rep's name, and when they do choose a name from this drop-down, I know that it's always spelt correctly and it's always presented as it should be, making my reporting a hell of a lot easier later on down the line. So these are the most important areas of data validation. There's many more facilities within the data validation menu, but one of the most important is the ability to create custom drop-down menus. Once again, I encourage you to load up an example workbook and experiment with this feature.